Okay, today we're going to look at section 2.2, conditional statements. The objectives are to recognize conditional statements and their parts, and to write converses, inverses, and contrapositives of conditionals. That, I think, is the hardest part at the end, just because it's all new vocabulary, it's all new math things for you. And it's not even going to really seem like a math thing when we get there. So I'll explain that here in a little bit. So just a little background on conditional statements. A conditional is an if-then statement. So if they ask you to turn some sentence into a conditional, you have to rewrite it as an if-then statement. If this, comma, then that. So we'll be doing that today. When you're looking at a conditional, the if part is the hypothesis. The then part is the conclusion. So they're actually just breaking it down. First of all, you see the if-then statement. Hypothesis is the part following if. It doesn't include the if, it's just the part following it. The conclusion is the part following the then part. The letters they have chosen are P for hypothesis, Q for conclusion. Okay, so when you write it with symbols, it's P arrow Q. That's the same as if P, then Q. Okay, so know the symbols. The Venn diagram part is something that some people really get into Venn diagrams and they really understand them. Some people are clueless when it comes to Venn diagrams. So I don't focus a super amount on it. For me, they don't mean a lot to me, but for some people they do. When you see that visual, it means a lot. So I might ask you to do these a time or two, but I don't think I asked any test questions on Venn diagrams. So if P, then Q. So P has to be included in Q for it to work. Does everybody have that one? Okay, so let's look at an example. What are the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional? So first of all, a conditional is an if-then statement, which it is. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pick out the parts that go with each. So what you do is you're looking for the hypothesis. What's the key word? Nope, what's the key word in the sentence? The if part. And when we're looking for the conclusion, what are we looking for? The then part. Okay, now it's easy for me because all I have to do is circle the parts. You guys would have to write them down. So I look for the if part. I don't circle that or write it down. I circle everything else. So this is my hypothesis right here. So hunt for the if part. And don't circle that with it. It's everything else in that particular statement. So my hypothesis is an animal is a robin. For the conclusion, you look for the word then, and you circle or write everything else. So my conclusion is the animal is a bird. Do not include then. Do not include if. If you include those, you don't get them right. Those are just your keywords that you're looking for. So far, pretty easy, right? You just have to get used to the wordage, I think, on the first few. Okay, what are the hypothesis and conclusion of the conditional? So again, a conditional is an if-then statement. We're looking for the hypothesis. What's my keyword? If. So I see it. I don't want that, but I want everything else. And I'll abbreviate it this time. So my hypothesis is an angle measures 130. Then I look for my conclusion. My keyword is then, and I circle or write everything else. You could do H colon and then write it and then C colon or something like that. You don't have to write out the whole word. So the conclusion, the angle is obtuse. That's the easiest part of today. I'm not saying that the rest is hard, it's just different. How can you write the following statement as a conditional? So this is the part where they want us to write an if-then statement. It's not given to you that way. So we have to actually rewrite it how we think we can. So identify which part is dependent on the other first. So vertical angles share a vertex. Okay, so if you are following along, it should be on like 90. This one is problem 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify which part is written first. Most of the time, whatever part is written first is the hypothesis. Whatever part is written second is the conclusion. And I'm saying most of the time. It really depends on how they wrote it. So the initial part right here is your hypothesis. The last part is your conclusion. But now we have to put it so that it makes sense and it has an if-then statement in it. Okay, so we're talking about vertical angles. So that means we're talking about angles, right? So I'm going to say if the angle or angles are vertical, okay, so I'm still using that exact same thing. We're talking about vertical angles. If the angles are vertical, then they share a vertex. Now, I'm going to flip it around just so you can see, what if you write it wrong? Does it still make sense? If the angles share a vertex, then the angles are vertical. Is that always true? No, because they could have a big space in between. One could be small, one could be big. So if the angles are vertical first, then they share a vertex. So you have to kind of identify which part's dependent on the other one before you write it. Okay, here's another one. How can you write dolphins are mammals as a conditional? Okay, so the two things we're talking about are dolphins and mammals. So those are your two things. This one is at about the middle of the page. It's the got it question in the middle. So we have to kind of write this so that it makes some sense. So first of all, what are mammals? They can be birds, they can be, what's the broad category of mammals? Warm animals.
They breathe air.
Breathe air. And we don't have to know super amounts of details, but they're all like animals, right? So you want a word that describes the whole thing, because you don't want to say if it's a mammal, like it, you want to say something about it so that it makes sense. It's kind of like in English where you have to use more descriptive words in there. So we're going to say if the animal is a dolphin, because again, dolphin we read first. So this is going to be kind of your hypothesis in there. This is going to be your conclusion. Okay, so if the animal, so I don't want to see it in that beginning part. Oops, if the animal is a dolphin, comma, then can I say it? In the second part of the sentence you can, right? Okay. So then,
have a noun to describe the pronoun.
Yeah, then it is a mammal. It is. Could you say then the animal is a mammal as well? Yep. Okay, so dolphin we read first. That's the hypothesis. That part goes with the if. Mammals we read second. And most of the time that works. Now, the truth value part, this is going to be quite a bit different. You have to figure out if the sentence is true or false. And there's certain things you have to know about that. So a conditional is true when the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is also true at the same time. Okay, so conditional is true. Hypothesis is true. And conclusion is true. So the first part has to be true, the if part. The then part also has to be true. And we'll go through some. Doesn't have to make sense, just has to be true. Okay? To show that a conditional is false. Find a counterexample to show that the conclusion is false. Okay, so if you read a conditional and the conclusion is false, the whole thing is automatically false. And these really won't make sense until we do a few of them, because this is something totally different than you've ever done before in math class. If it is false, you should be able to find some sort of counterexample. And remember, that's one example that shows that the whole entire thing is false. Okay, so problem 3. Is the conditional true or false? If it's false, find a counterexample. If a woman is Hungarian, then she is European. Now, some of these in the book, you guys might have to Google, okay? Now, basically, if you don't know where Hungary is, you wouldn't know the answer to this question, right? So definitely Google. Now, what's going to happen is I'm not going to give you anything on a quiz or test that you wouldn't already know, like that you wouldn't have some background information on. So the examples that I choose aren't going to be whether you know the world map in your head. It's, do you know how to do this question? So some of the examples that the book chooses aren't super awesome. I mean, they're fine, but you may not know that. So look at the bottom of page 90. Is Hungary in Europe, for anybody that knows geography?
It's in Europe, yeah, I just looked it up.
Okay, it is in Europe. So if you guys were at home and you didn't know that, you would say, give me the, is Hungary in Europe? Just Google it, okay? It is in Europe, so the first part is true, and the second part is also true because Hungary is in Europe. Okay, so I'm going to say, just as a little hint, both hypothesis and conclusion are true, and the whole thing is true. So would you have to describe it that way? No, you could just say true. How about this one? If a number is divisible by 3, then it is odd. Okay, so Lexi, you were shaking your head no. Can you come up with a number that's divisible by 3 that isn't odd?
6. Oh, sorry.
12.
Okay, so we're going to go 12 is divided by 3, and we could have done 6 too. That's 4, but 4 is an even number. Okay, so your counterexample is 12. And for these, you kind of have to show it. So I showed it by just explaining it. 12 divided by 3 is 4, but 4 is an even number. So that's what makes it false. So this counterexample makes that conclusion false. So the whole thing would be false. So it's not true and true. It's true. The whole thing is true. Or the whole thing is false. Okay, here's another one. If a month has 28 days, then it is February. Okay, why is that one false?
Leap years.
Because every month has 28 days.
Every month has 28 days, right? It just happens that February doesn't have any more than that. Okay, so this one's going to be false, and you could pick basically any month, right? So I'm going to say false. My counterexample, I'm going to say March. You could have a different counterexample than mine. Okay, if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. So is this one true or false? What is a linear pair, first of all? For those, you are looking for something that looks like this. Linear pairs are adjacent angles that have that line on the bottom that are right next to each other. Now, how much do those add up to if I draw that picture like that?
180.
So would they be supplementary? Yep,
Yeah.
this one is true. If I switched it around and I said, if two angles are supplementary, then they're a linear pair, that one could be false because supplementary angles don't have to be next to each other. Okay, so it kind of depends on how they word it. This one is okay. The negation of a statement is the opposite of a statement. These are super, super easy. So this is another one of the parts that are easy. The little tilde is this symbol right here. It's kind of a tilde in Spanish as well, everybody in Spanish, those people that are. It's read not. So if I give you a symbol or a word and I want you to negate it, you're going to put is not, will not, have not, whatever you have that makes that sentence sound right. So if we want to negate the sky is blue, we would change it to the sky is not blue. Okay, don't make it hard. Just do what it says. You're going to add the word not somewhere in there and just write it. Doesn't have to be true. You're just negating it or writing the opposite. These. I'm going to tell you what to write down. Don't do the whole entire table. I'm going to make it a lot simpler. Let's do this column and this column. Okay, so just those two columns. I'm going to give you a minute to do those, and then I'm going to kind of explain how to do these. So the first one, the conditional, is just your basic if-then statement. If P, then Q. Your converse is if Q, then P. So basically you are taking the order that it was in the original conditional and you are switching the order. And we'll look at some examples so you know kind of where these are coming from. The inverse is the same order as your conditional, but each of those is negated. So not P, if not P, then not Q. And then the contrapositive, you are switching the order of the inverse. It's if not Q, then not P. So I'm going to put some hints on here. Okay, so to go from the conditional to the converse, you're going to switch the order of the original one. The inverse, the same order as the original, and negate both. The last one, switch order of inverse. Generally, they're going to have you do these in the exact same order every single time. You'll get used to how one kind of relates to the next. I won't ever say I want contrapositive, inverse, converse. I'll always say converse, inverse, contrapositive, because the more you do them in the same order, the more it sticks in your brain, and they'll be easier after that. So I won't trick you and put them in the wrong order. Generally, when you do one, you have to do all three. Okay. A conditional and its contrapositive are equivalent statements. You need this. So equivalent statements, conditional, contrapositive. Okay, now let's look and see which ones those are. Okay, that's these two. Okay, now I put, it's kind of like an equals with a third bar above it. That just means the truth values of those are going to be the same. Okay, also the converse and inverse are equivalent statements. Okay, so the truth value of the conditional, the truth value of the contrapositive are going to be exactly the same, no matter what. The truth value of the converse and the truth value of the inverse are going to be exactly the same, no matter what. How is this going to help you? When you are trying to figure out if it's true or false, when they throw the words not in there, it's not always easy to figure out what it's actually saying, because it sounds really weird. So if you can figure out the first two, you automatically have the last two, as long as you remember which one's paired with which. So the first one and the fourth one to go together, the second one and the third one go together, as far as truth values go. Okay, what are the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the following conditional? And here we go. So write at least one example down just so that you have it. Then you'll have one and you'll be able to kind of whip through your homework without too much trouble. Now, I'm going to do a little more writing than what you guys would have to do. I'm just kind of showing you how I'm thinking on paper. So first of all, we need to identify what is P, what is Q. P is your hypothesis, Q is your conclusion. So remember, for the hypothesis, what's the key word? Is it if or then? It's if. So I'm going to cross off the if part, and this is my P. So P is the figure is a square. I'm going to find my then and cross it off, and I'm going to underline the rest or write the rest. That's going to be my Q part. The figure is a quadrilateral. So if you look at that table that we just wrote, so I don't have to page up again, it says for the converse, it's Q arrow P. For the inverse, it is not P, arrow, not Q. And for the contrapositive, you're going to switch that one around. Not Q, arrow, not P. Now, if you have them written next to the item that you're doing, all you have to do is select what you've written from the top and write it down. It's a lot of writing, but that's kind of how these are. So converse says we're going to do if Q, then P. So the reason I crossed out if and then are they're not attached to the statements that you're using. The order is changed. So you still start out with the if statement, but you're going to switch the order. So this one reads, if the figure is a quadrilateral, then it is a square. So all I did was, since I identified my letters up here and what they stood for, I am looking for the P part and the Q part, and I'm switching the order. That's all I'm doing, is switching the order. Now let's decide if that's true or false right now. So what's a quadrilateral? How many sides?
4.
4. So if we have something that has 4 sides, then it's a square.
Rectangles.
Okay? And remember, if you, did it say, did we have to do true or false? No, it didn't. But if we did, we could say false rectangle, correct? Because we could come up with one thing that still is a quadrilateral, but not a square. So we're just writing them this time, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. Okay, inverse now says, I want to keep the order of the original, but I want to put not in each part. So I'm going to write it like this. If the figure is not a square, then I'm going to negate the second part too. The figure is not or isn't a quadrilateral. So I kept the order the same and I put not in there. And then for the contrapositive, the order of the inverse is switched. Or you could go back to the beginning and say the Q part with a not in it, and the if part with a not in it. So either one. I always go back to the inverse because it's just that one switched around, but you can do either one, from the beginning or the inverse. So if the figure isn't a quadrilateral, then the figure is not or isn't a square. A lot of writing, but do you feel like they're super hard? As long as you've written the original one right, they should be just, just copy it and switch 2 words, basically. Now, sometimes you're going to have to do trues or falses. So we said the converse was false, right? So which one is paired with that one? Which other one would be false?
Inverse.
The inverse. So isn't it easier to figure out the converse than if I said this one? If the figure isn't a square, then the figure isn't a quadrilateral. Wouldn't that be harder to do with those knots in there? That's why if you figure out the first 2, you already know the other 2. So we're not going to go through those this time, but that's kind of how I think when I'm doing them. Okay. Again, what are the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the statements? This one is talking about vegetables. So on this one, does anyone know what beta-carotenes are?
Some kind of vitamin.
Yeah. But if you don't know a lot about it, you wouldn't really be able to figure out the trues and falses of it, right? So on a quiz or test, I wouldn't quiz you about biology or the makeup of something that you didn't know about. Okay, it would be more basic questions. So we can write these no matter what they give us, but we may not be able to figure out what they're talking about because we don't have that background knowledge. Okay, so what's my P going to be? Okay, a vegetable is a carrot. Okay, and I'll do the other one in a different color. Then we look for the then. My Q is going to be, it contains beta carotene. Okay, so converse says what? Switch the order. Q, if Q, then P. So I'm going to say if a vegetable, so notice that this one starts with it. Don't ever start your sentences with it. You have to know what you're talking about. So if a vegetable contains beta carotene, then it is a carrot. Now, do you think carrots are the only vegetables with beta carotene in them? Probably not. There's probably more. So I would say if I was guessing, the original one might be true. The converse is probably false because you can probably find some other vegetable that is high in beta carotene that isn't a carrot. What do you do for inverse again? And is it PQ or QP? PQ, not P arrow, not Q. Okay. I have to go down just a little bit. Okay, so if a vegetable is not a carrot, and I'm going to abbreviate a little bit. Then it doesn't, oops. I'm not sure what is going on here with my pen. I don't want the keyboard. There we go. So it doesn't contain beta carotene. And then the contrapositive is just the opposite of this one that we just wrote. So if a vegetable doesn't contain beta carotene, then it is not a carrot. So what do you think about those? A lot of writing, but are they hard? Do you think they seem hard? If you identify P and Q at the beginning by writing it down or underlining it or something, they're not so bad. And that is it for this one. So we learned a lot. We learned how to write a conditional, how to determine if they're true, false, how to write converse, inverse, contrapositives, and lots of definitional things. Okay, so it's a lot of new stuff, but it's not a lot of hard things. It's just things that you haven't done before.